Thank you very much. So our last presentation of this first part is related to the results Philip have about the Mekong area. Thank you, Philip.
Yes, thanks so much. And I actually realized that a lot of things happened on our research in the Mekong Delta since the TISOLS in Japan, when we actually, it's Esther and Gilles and myself, only just started with the research in this delta. So it's a pleasure to actually give you this, let's say, update, but also forward look of what we are currently doing. So you see a large list of people who are presently working on it and some of the main contributors of the past advancements that we did. So we're going to look at the Mekong Delta and what we try in the advancements to improve, and especially to look towards the different depth domains. So what is actually contributing to the total amount of land subsidence in this delta, also in relation to relative sea level rise projections. So just a small wrap up on this delta. We're talking about the third largest delta plain in the world. It is at the end of the Mekong River, coming down the Himalayas, from the Himalayan plateau all the way to the south of current Vietnam. It's a very important region for food production. It's densely populated, so in terms of size and in terms of population density, we talk about the same as the Netherlands, actually, so it's very comparable. And it's actually very flat, and I would argue it's even flatter than the Dutch landscape, because we have a lot of this, let's say, man-made relief, which is not yet present in this delta. And on average, this delta plain is very lowly elevated, as we've seen now from different sources, and it's lower than 1 meter above mean sea level. That's a very small tidal range, but it means that losing a little bit of elevation through land subsidence actually can have very large effects in this delta. And we can see that, for example, here in this small animation. And the delta is losing elevation. So here we see two INSAR analysis, so one from 2006 to 2010. And we see rates in the delta in hotspots between 2 and 3 centimeters per year. And then if we move to a more recent INSAR analysis 10 years later, 2014, 2019, we see the hotspots in the delta, they actually show rates that are doubled, so 5 to 6 centimeters per year even. So there's an acceleration here in observations. And here again we see the most recent INSAR, and you can clearly see these hotspots of higher land subsidence, but also the stable points situated around the outcrops of bedrock. And there's two messages here. So land subsidence is much higher than sea level rise for this delta. But also that land subsidence is now affecting almost the entire delta plain. So we really talk about an example where it's not just one city or a small region, but it is an entire mega delta that is suffering from high rates of land subsidence. Here you see some of the pictures that you can find when you're traveling around in the delta, and some evidence of shallow subsidence, right? These bridge hedges are founded, and then the road leading up to the bridge are not, so you get these typical cracks. These houses that have sunk below the water level, and of course these big groundwater wells that stick like really nice monuments of past surface level. Just to wrap up some of the mechanisms of land subsidence, and there's been a few other versions on this conference. So this is the one that I like to use. So we have a cross section of a delta. And of course, as you all know, it's a natural process, so there's different things happening in the shallow domain, in the deep domains, stemming all the way from the earth crust dynamics, but also, of course, in the unconsolidated zone. Well, if you add loading to the surface, you increase the total effective stress, also causing consolidation. Well, as we've all seen on the different excursions yesterday, the managing of groundwater levels is a very important driver in this country, for example. And of course the extraction of fluids from the deeper surface. This can be water, hydrocarbons, etc. But we can make a sort of a distinction. Of course, it's a range, a continuous range from shallow drivers, local land subsidence, to deeper drivers and more regional signals, right? And as you all know, of course, the human-induced processes, they tend to be able to create much higher land subsidence rates than the natural ones. Maybe apart from earthquakes, perhaps those can also create large deformations, of course. And then, as you know, land subsidence can be highly variable both in space and time. And it's actually much more variable in these rates than it is than the sea level changes. And this is a realization that is very common in our community, but it is actually not very common to understand and to realize in other communities. So I think that's very important to highlight that. Some of the past work that we did in the past years in the Mekong Delta, we created with a lot of data 3D hydrogeological model. We have a lot of observations, fortunately going back to the early 90s, which coincided with the onset of extraction of groundwater, the overexploitation. And that was, well, we were lucky actually to have that kind of data, but it gave us really a perfect data set. So we went from a pristine system that was hardly affected by overextraction towards the present. We had the earliest version of the INSAR to check our results with, and we could model the extractions of groundwater, and with that the compaction of the aquifer system. So actually what we modeled, and this was before we had the second INSAR data set, but we saw this increase of extraction-induced compaction as a result of increased aquifer overexploitation. So this was, when we published it, more or less the first time it was shown that there was an acceleration, and it was, okay, it's only a model, right? So how certain are you? And after that we got this new INSAR, and we saw indeed this acceleration as well in the satellite data. So what we did then was we had this great tool, and when you have a tool like that, you can actually use it also to go towards the future and try to make some predictions. So we made some scenarios of future extractions, non-mitigation scenarios, which allow to increase the growth of extractions that we simply reflected on the past, the average rate and the maximum annual rate. And then we made some mitigation scenarios to test the system and see what was happening. So we fed that to the model, and well, of course, we got out the evolution of hydraulic head in the different aquifers, and also the cumulative compaction right there. And you can see the M4 scenario, for example, where we completely stop all the extractions. It gave us an idea how fast would the system recharge under natural conditions without any extractions, and also what would be the residual compaction happening. And this is both delayed primary consolidation and also creep contribution. And the great thing with this is that you can now, if you have a projection like that, you can treat the effect of relative sea level rise from the land side, and we can create these kind of plots that we usually only see for sea level rise projection, but we can now do it for anthropogenic induced land subsidence, which is of course the other side of your relative sea level rise projection. So it's really helpful to also visualize this and talk to policymakers what their actions and their policies are actually doing in terms of this effect. So what we then did is we had these different scenarios of future potential extraction-induced land subsidence, and we connected that to the elevation of the delta. So let's have a look at the actually quite a strong mitigation scenario, M3. So we really reduce quite heavily the amount of groundwater extraction. Then you arrive to a projection of elevation of the delta that you see right here. When you see blue arriving, it means that the elevation falls below mean sea level. There's also sea level rise projections behind this analysis. It doesn't mean it is flooded or drowned, because of course it can be protected to some extent. But it gives you, well, the vulnerability of the area and the costs of protecting it severely increases, as you can imagine, as is the amount of salinization, for example, as well. If we go to the M1 scenario, the scenario in which we actually fix the extractions at the 2018 year, well, we see an increase of land subsidence and, well, an increase of the extractions. And then if we take the moderate increase scenario, well, we see actually that even in a few decades from now, large parts already fall below sea level with all the consequences. And one of the messages that we really try to stress when we talk to policymakers in Vietnam is that the extraction of groundwater is not free, right? Because you pay, in a way, in one-on-one with the loss of elevation and also an increase in salinization. So what we're doing now currently is to actually revisit the model on all different aspects and improve. So this is work that is led by Bente Lexmond. She's I think somewhere also here. No, yeah, right there in the back. Very good. So we're looking at the different, let's say, choices in modeling that we made in the first version and how this can affect the outcomes and how we can improve it. So the hydraulic connectivity of the aquifers, but also the discretization of the different layering. And how we can how that affects the compaction assessment, and how we can move towards the future to improve this. And then there's another big effort, and it's led by Arthur Guzzi, also here present at the conference. And we basically work towards a version 2.0 of the hydrogeological model. So we significantly improve the amount of geology that's fed into the model. There's a proper coupling between the hydrogeology and geomechanical parameterization, and we actually use a lot of new, more recent data. So it gives us also the option to actually reflect back. So what happened in the last few years, how well were our projections, and what is actually the trajectory of this delta, right? Which of these lines that we projected are we actually following now? So that should be interesting. This is other work done by Kim de Wit, also present here right there, looking at PS INSAR of different buildings in 3 cities in the delta, and it was actually very interesting because we sort of used these buildings and their foundation depth and then the street next to the buildings as a sort of extensometers, right? So we could use those to find the differential subsidence that was happening within the city. And especially in the southern point of the delta, it learned us that much of the compaction that was registered by the INSAR was happening in the shallow domain, so between the surface and the foundation depth of the large buildings. So what's actually very important to say here, so it's what the INSAR registered, right? There's no stable benchmarks in this area, so the INSAR has been referenced through different frames until we reach the bedrock. So we're not sure what the INSAR is saying. Let's say relatively, we have quite some faith in it, but absolute values we could miss part of the actual subsidence occurring here. But at least we see a large differential subsidence happening. So it gives us also a new question, because as soon as this came out, the Vietnamese said, oh, well, it's shallow subsidence, so groundwater extraction is not an issue, right? Because it can't drive it. Well, actually, we're not sure, because what could happen is that you actually drain these thick surface aquifers from the bottom through groundwater extraction. And this led us also to a new, let's say, question in line that we're now trying to exploit. How much of the, let's say, impacts of the aquifer system is seeping through to this quite thick and developed Holocene, let's say, deck of 20, 30 meters clays, right? And we expect actually that there is significant drainage happening, but then from the bottom of this layer causing things. Thanks. So I'll speed up. Something else that we did on the natural compaction. So the delta prograded very fast in time. And it's very shallow deposits. We see that right here. So this top 20 meters. And we could model this, and we did with Claudia, Zoccarato, and Pietro in a 2D model in which we actually connected delta evolution to natural compaction rates. Well, in a first attempt to make this for the entire delta, so it's a more of a, let's say, stupid interpolation based on the presence of clay, we arrived to this map. And I'll leave it to that. And what we're doing now is actually to move towards a 3D of the same type of modeling. So this is an approach developed, and the work is led by Selena Baldan, also present here, in which we use the wealth of corings that we have and age information to create a 3D, basically the last 4,000 years, the paleoevolution of this delta, which we could feed to the new 3D, NatSub 3D model that was recently developed and published at the University of Padua. So we could now simulate the growth of this delta in the last 4,000 years And we start from pristine sedimentation, so we don't put any of the parameters in there other than what is the pristine sediment and the pristine parameterization, and then simply the loading effect changes all these parameters. So well, it's the first time that we apply this model to a real-world case. I hear the time is almost up, so I'll wrap it up. So here we see some graphics where we try. Another thing we want to do, we want to link this aquifer system model to this shallow model, and in that try to see if we can have this depth-dependent effects. I'll skip that. And then one thing before I close off, this is for everyone who's working on coastal land subsidence, and it's an initiative which we are now launching, and part of the communities that target by this is actually are you guys in this room. So we try to unite all the land subsidence communities that are working in the coastal zone, so we can actually improve relative sea level rise projections, and eventually link up to IPCC reports on that. There is a poster tomorrow on this. I thank you for your attention. Thanks.
Thank you, Philip. We have time for questions. Joe?
For this very nice presentation. I have a question about, you mentioned your ongoing modeling. You use the new hydraulic head data and also new SAR data to improve your model. So I just wonder, what do you expect from that new model compared to your old model? Yeah, this one question. Another one is that you mentioned you are now working on deep domain, right? The depth, you mean before you focused on the shallow domain? Mm-hmm. Now you look the deeper one. So what the difference between the shallow and the deep?
Yes, thanks a lot for these questions. First, the second one. So the domains, let's say where we look at is, I would quantify as medium domain, so the aquifer system, so the deeper unconsolidated domain. And then the deep domain, I would say that would be the bedrock dynamics. We don't look at the deep domain, I would say. So we don't have good constraints in this delta, what would be tectonics, etc. Simply because it is below up to a kilometer of unconsolidated sediments. So we've looked mainly first in this middle domain of the aquifer system, and now with this new 3D model, we really try to understand also the Holocene stratigraphy, basically, and what that would contribute to the land substance, as we saw from this differential land substance. And then your first question, so we have, let's say, extended the series of hydraulic head to last year. And what we see, if you just glance at the data on the hydraulic head, the amount of declines, they've been continuing as before. So it seems as a first guess that we arrive somewhere between the B1 and the B2 scenario. So we're actually outside of the elevation projections because it looks like the rates are even a bit higher than that. And then also good to say that the average, let's say, speed that we model with the hydrogeological model, it's the best estimate, but it's much lower than this 5 or 6 centimeters per year. So we model 1 to 1.5 centimeters, which is like a larger average, but I suspect there's much more contribution in the shallow. So I think we're going to see really things visible happening in this delta within our lifetimes. Yes, let's try to.
One more question here.
Thank you for the presentations. I have one question about the modeling issues, because the recharge and pumping could be the calibrate parameter or be the input data. So for your model, is that the input or the calibrated result?
So we start with an input. So we have estimates and we have well locations and depths and quantities of water extracted. but those are measured at certain times. But we needed to have also a time series of extractions, so that's more or less an increase of the behavior. So what we did is we took those spots in time, and we actually then took the average decline of the hydraulic head over the years to give a time input to what would happen to the extractions. So in that sense, the extractions are linked in quantity to the hydraulic head evolution, which we had constraints on because we have this magnificent data set of the evolution of the hydraulic head. Does it answer your question? Yep.
One more question.
So I was wondering about your statement that it seems that all of the substance is related to the shallow subsurface. That would mean to the first, what, 5 meters or so maybe? Or that it seems a little unlikely because there's only so much substance that you can get from a limited thickness of a package, right?
Yes, well, what we simulate subsidence actually much deeper in the aquifer system. But what we saw from that particular study was that most of the INSA registered subsidence for those cities happened in this shallow domain. So there you talk about 80 or plus %. But then again, the question is if this INSAR actually represents your absolute rates or if it's just a very good estimate of the relative rates that happens between the street level and these founded buildings. Because it may that the INSAR is actually missing everything below the depth of foundation. Because I know during the processing that I've asked also the processing guys, they pick very tall buildings or high-rise buildings as their reference points. But if you do that, you actually are creating let's say a fake stable position and you miss out on the whole aquifer. And there is 3 in the southern point 3 extensometers, but they only measure the entire column. So unfortunately, they don't have this depth. I mean, there will be a wish to have good extensometers that actually measure it at different depths. Yeah, and hopefully they will be installed soon. But yeah, that would solve a lot of these open questions. Thanks.
Still more work to do. Thank you again.
Thanks.